Hey guys, tonight we begin with a gentle stroll through the quiet, meticulous world of the Abbasid Palace librarians. Picture it. The year is somewhere around the 9th century, the golden glow of Baghdad is reflected in the Tigris, and somewhere in the heart of the palace, a small, dedicated army of bookish scribes and librarians moves silently through endless corridors lined with scrolls and manuscripts. Take a deep breath, dim the lights, and let's drift into the soft, repetitive routines of a world long past, but filled with paper, ink, and the faint scratch of quills. The Abbasid Caliphate, of course, was famous for a few things: its sprawling libraries, its love of knowledge, and occasionally, its rulers' questionable taste in poetry. But somewhere behind the more glamorous tales of court intrigue and opulent feasts lived the librarians, the unsung heroes of quiet order. These were the people who actually knew which book belonged where, who catalogued the works of mathematicians, poets, physicians, and astrologers, and who somehow managed not to lose their minds in the labyrinth of parchment. Their days began with the subtle murmur of palace life, servants shuffling through stone corridors, the distant clang of a kitchen pot, the soft footfalls of courtiers unaware that someone, somewhere, was preserving their legacies for future centuries. The librarians themselves were often former scribes, men who had spent their youth learning the delicate art of writing Arabic script without blotting the ink. Some were trained in calligraphy so fine that even a distracted observer might believe the letters were woven rather than written. By mid-morning, the palace would settle into a rhythm. Librarians walked slowly along rows of shelves stacked with scrolls, each hand carefully dusting the parchment, ensuring the edges weren't frayed, the ink wasn't fading. It might sound boring, but in a world without digital backups, this was the difference between preserving centuries of knowledge and losing it forever. And let's be honest, it was also a good excuse for anyone with a mild obsession with order. Meals were usually simple. A librarian might nibble on dates or sip watered-down wine, all while jotting marginal notes on the latest philosophical treatise that had arrived from distant lands. They were neither rich nor powerful, though some enjoyed minor privileges, like slightly better lodging or the ability to request a new inkpot in fancy colors. One can imagine them quietly envying the caliph's more decadent lifestyle, while secretly feeling superior for having mastered every nuance of copying texts without error. Some librarians developed peculiar habits over the years, not out of madness, but because monotony invites minor eccentricities. One might have a particular way of rolling scrolls, always to the right. Another might hum the same low tune while reading aloud, a sound so soft it could barely be heard over the turning of parchment. And there was always the occasional overzealous librarian who would insist on cataloging a manuscript in multiple places, just to make sure future generations could not possibly misplace it. Of course, life was not entirely quiet. Occasionally, a visiting scholar would arrive, bearing news of far-off lands, new mathematical methods, or a poem written in such tiny script it required a magnifying glass. The librarian would nod solemnly, occasionally making notes, but more often simply allowing the scholar to speak while imagining, perhaps, how much simpler life would be if there were fewer people talking and more parchment to organize. Palace politics had an indirect effect on the librarians, though they rarely interacted with power directly. A new caliph might decree that certain texts were essential reading, or that a particular philosopher's works were now in fashion. This could result in frantic reorganization, the librarians silently cursing the whims of rulers who had no idea that the act of moving 100 scrolls across shelves was more taxing than most armies' campaigns. And yet, they did it, because the alternative, outright defiance, was not an option, and they preferred ink-stained hands to the cold echo of a palace dungeon. By the afternoon, the light in the library shifted, softening across the mosaic floors and illuminating the shelves in a lazy golden haze. Librarians would sit on cushions, feet tucked beneath them, carefully copying texts or cataloging new arrivals. Some texts were fragile, perhaps brought from distant cities like Damascus, Cairo, or Cordoba, and they required delicate handling. Others were mundane, copies of administrative records or tax ledgers, but the librarians treated all with equal reverence. After all, who could predict which scroll would someday illuminate the mind of a future historian? Or, more likely, be used to lull someone into a calm, sleepy stupor. Evening brought quieter tasks. Lanterns flickered in the corners of the library, casting long shadows across the parchment. Some librarians might whisper to one another, discussing minor errors in texts or debating which classification system made the most sense. But mostly, there was silence. The act of being surrounded by so much knowledge, in a palace bustling with human activity, created a peculiar, peaceful solitude. A gentle hum of paper and ink, punctuated only by the occasional cough or the shifting of a stool. And then came night. The caliph retired, the guards patrolled the outer walls, and the librarians did their final rounds. Scrolls were checked, inkpots were capped, and any stray dust was carefully removed. They might settle into a quiet corner with a favorite manuscript, letting their minds drift gently over verses, formulas, or obscure philosophical arguments. Some may have even dozed briefly, quill in hand, lulled to sleep by the soft rhythm of their own meticulous work. In a sense, the life of an Abbasid palace librarian was entirely unremarkable, if one looked at it from the perspective of grand history. There were no bloody battles, no epic conquests, no scandalous affairs. Yet, it was this quiet consistency that allowed the knowledge of centuries to survive. And perhaps, as we imagine these figures moving among scrolls and ink, we too can feel a subtle relaxation wash over us, the way one might while listening to the soft rustle of leaves or the gentle tick of a clock in a silent room. It is tempting to think of these librarians as invisible, mere shadows behind the grandeur of the caliphs and their magnificent courts. But they were not invisible. They were the guardians of culture, the quiet curators of human thought, the people who made sure that stories, calculations, and laws were preserved. Without them, the golden age of Abbasid learning might have been little more than a bright spark quickly extinguished. And while they certainly didn't enjoy the fame of rulers, generals, or poets, they did have their small pleasures. A perfectly aligned scroll, a rare manuscript discovered in an unexpected corner, or the quiet acknowledgement from a colleague that, yes, this copy was flawless. And in the end, isn't that a kind of success worth savoring? A small, measured victory in the gentle march of history. As the night deepened and the lamps flickered lower, the librarians would finish their work and retreat to small, modest chambers. Perhaps a cup of warm milk or a simple bread awaited them. Perhaps they lingered a few moments more by a favorite text. And as they finally lay down to rest, they left the library in perfect order, the scrolls aligned, the knowledge intact, ready for another day. It is in this slow, repetitive rhythm, this world of ink, parchment, and quiet diligence, that we find a peculiar kind of beauty. Not the kind that makes one leap from a chair or gasp at a scandalous revelation, but the kind that allows the mind to drift, the eyelids to grow heavy, and the world outside to fade into soft shadow. It is a gentle lullaby, crafted not of song, but of history itself. So, as we close our eyes and imagine the Abbasid palace in the quiet of the night, let us remember the librarians, patient, meticulous, quietly heroic in their devotion to the written word. And if, by some chance, you feel a soft sleepiness creeping over you, consider it their gift. A gentle invitation to float alongside the scrolls, among the ink-stained shelves, and drift through time at a pace measured not by wars or feasts, but by the calm turning of parchment. Not all librarians were created equal. Some were fastidious beyond reason, spending hours aligning scrolls by author, subject, or even the type of ink used. Take, for instance, a certain librarian named al-Rashid al-Khatib, no relation to the caliph, though he might have liked to think so. He had an unusual obsession with dates. The date a manuscript was copied, the date it was originally written, the date a scribe might have sneezed while writing it, all meticulously recorded. His colleagues tolerated this because, frankly, no one else wanted the responsibility of cataloging the royal poetry collection. And, of course, he was slightly terrifying in a quiet, clipboard-wielding way. Another librarian, Hakim, preferred a more tactile approach. She spent her days gently rolling scrolls open and closed, tracing the edges with a fingertip as if she could feel the knowledge within. She had a habit of sniffing old manuscripts, probably not sanctioned, but technically no one ever wrote a rule against it, and claimed that certain scrolls smelled of wisdom. Her colleagues mostly nodded politely and moved on, though some suspected she just liked the scent of aged parchment. By mid-morning, a faint but consistent rhythm filled the library. Quills scratched against paper, ink pots were carefully stirred, and a low hum of whispered cataloging filled the air. Librarians walked from shelf to shelf, checking margins, correcting tiny errors, and occasionally adding their own cryptic notes. Perhaps the poet meant X, or perhaps he sneezed. These notes were not for the public, nor even necessarily for the next generation. Mostly, they were little reminders to themselves that they had existed, however quietly, in the golden hum of the palace's knowledge machine. Meals were another peculiar ritual. Librarians often ate alone or in small clusters. Bread, dates, and occasionally lamb stew were the staples. Sharing food was less about camaraderie and more about ensuring someone else didn't mishandle a manuscript while reaching for a date. During these meals, discussions could be surprisingly lively, though always under the same soft, monotone hum of palace life. Topics ranged from the correct way to pronounce a particularly obscure poet's name, to whether a newly arrived manuscript was authentic or a clever forgery. Every debate was conducted with a gentle insistence on precision and, often, a slight undercurrent of sarcasm. Some librarians had what might be called ritualized superstitions. For example, a scroll copied during a lunar eclipse was considered particularly potent, so one librarian would leave it on the top shelf, wrapped in silk, to avoid misfortune. Another insisted that certain texts be read only while wearing a particular cloak, reasoning that the fibers somehow connected the reader to the words. None of these practices had any real effect, of course, except to give the librarian something to quietly obsess over, which, as it turns out, was a large part of the job. Palace visits could be tricky. Occasionally, a scholar or diplomat would wander into the library, asking questions like, "Do you have the complete works of Al-Farabi?" Or, "Where might I find this obscure treatise on geometry?" Librarians had to answer with calm precision, though internally many might have thought, "Why are you bothering me when I could be alphabetizing another shelf?" Sometimes, a particularly picky visitor would attempt to rearrange a few scrolls themselves. This rarely ended well, as a sharp look or a gentle, clipped, "Please don't," usually restored order. Afternoon hours were often the most monotonous. Some librarians would do nothing but review previous cataloging decisions, ensuring every scroll was perfectly aligned. Others found solace in transcribing poetry, though rarely aloud. Their hands moved rhythmically over parchment, and it was not uncommon for the room to feel like a slow, breathing organism, moving as one toward the inevitable sunset. The palace itself sometimes intervened in quiet ways. A caliph might suddenly decree that a certain philosopher's works were essential for enlightened thought, leading to weeks of frantic repositioning. Shelves were shifted, manuscripts temporarily displaced, and the librarian's careful order disrupted. Though outwardly obedient, they might grumble softly among themselves. Because why not double down on moving 200 scrolls just to please someone who can barely read past their own poetry? They returned everything to order, eventually, but not without a subtle sigh or an extra careful check to ensure the next person did not touch anything. Evenings were perhaps the most reflective part of the day. Some librarians would read quietly, tracing the faded ink of centuries-old texts. Others sat in small alcoves, meditating on the rhythm of their own work. Some, in moments of weakness, would write a short note to themselves, recording small thoughts, dreams, or complaints about particular scrolls. A favorite complaint was the consistent tendency of certain authors to write in overly cramped script. If he wanted his readers to squint until their eyes watered, he succeeded admirably, one librarian noted in the margin of a particularly tiny treatise on astronomy. Librarians had their little competitions too. Who could copy the most accurate transcript in a day? Who could identify a miswritten word before anyone else? Who could arrange the manuscripts in a pattern so pleasing it could almost be considered art? These contests were quiet, of course. No cheering, no prizes, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing at the end of a long day that one had performed a small but important victory in the vast machinery of knowledge. Nighttime brought a slower pace. Lanterns flickered, casting soft shadows on rows of parchment. Librarians would do a final round, making sure that every scroll was secure, every inkpot capped, and every margin free from accidental stains. Some might linger by a particular manuscript, reading the poetry or philosophy softly to themselves. Others, having spent long hours with the same text, drifted off mid-sentence, only to wake a few minutes later and resume copying as if nothing had happened. In these quiet hours, one could notice the subtle differences among the librarians. Some were meticulous, careful, and deliberate in every motion. Others were impulsive, quick, and occasionally clumsy, yet somehow nothing was ever lost. There was a rhythm to it all. Ink, parchment, quiet steps, the occasional whisper, and the gentle brushing of dust from the edges of scrolls. It was repetitive, yes, but there was a peculiar comfort in the repetition. And while these lives may seem dull from the outside, they were, in fact, profoundly human. Each librarian had a personality, habits, and small quirks that, when observed together, created a kind of slow-moving tapestry of palace life. Some were obsessive, some lazy, some quietly brilliant, some quietly terrified of misplacing even a single sheet of paper. They were, in a sense, the heartbeat of the Abbasid intellectual world, silent but steady. So, as the night deepened and the palace settled into stillness, the librarians finished their work, tucked away the scrolls, and retreated to their modest quarters. Perhaps they thought of far-off lands mentioned in the texts, perhaps of their own small ambitions, or perhaps they simply let their minds drift. And in that quiet drifting, they preserved not just words, but centuries of human thought, care, and, if we are being honest, obsessive tiny grievances about misaligned scrolls. Among the Abbasid Palace librarians, there was always one or two who stood out, not because they were particularly brilliant or ambitious, but because their quirks were impossible to ignore. Take, for example, a man named Ishaq ibn Malik. He had an obsession with ink colors. He would spend an hour choosing just the right shade of black for each scroll, as if the precise hue could somehow influence the quality of the knowledge within. His colleagues occasionally teased him, noting that, in the grand scheme of the Caliphate, slightly lighter or darker ink would make little difference. Ishaq would only smile faintly and continue to swirl his quill. Then there was Fatima al-Jawari, known for her almost ritualistic arrangement of scrolls. She organized by subject first, then author, then date, and then by the precise width of the parchment. If a scroll was even a millimeter off, she would sigh, reposition it, and sometimes mutter softly about the decay of civilization. Her fellow librarians tolerated this because, despite her obsessive tendencies, she had an uncanny ability to locate even the most obscure manuscript in seconds. A missing treatise on medicinal herbs? Fatima could produce it in less time than it took anyone else to blink. Some librarians, however, found pleasure in subtler, quieter games. One would deliberately misplace a single scroll and watch colleagues search for it, noting the meticulous mental maps they had formed of the shelves. It was a harmless form of entertainment, really, and often led to quiet laughter, soft, restrained, almost imperceptible, before everyone returned to their careful work. Occasionally, librarians developed secret rivalries. Two men might dispute the correct classification of a particularly ambiguous manuscript, one insisting it was a work of philosophy, the other claiming it belonged to poetry. These disputes were conducted in whispers, over the faint scratching of quills, with each man subtly repositioning scrolls to assert dominance. Neither ever outright acknowledged the other's opinion publicly. The library was too vast, and their work too slow, for dramatic confrontations. Still, the tension added a curious flavor to the otherwise rhythmic day. Personal habits varied widely. Some librarians drank only water, while others occasionally indulged in tea or sweetened milk. One old librarian insisted on chewing a particular kind of reed while reading, claiming it helped him focus. Another, far less disciplined, would nap mid-morning, letting his quill dangle just above the scrolls, only to wake, check his work, and resume as if nothing had happened. These small eccentricities were tolerated and even quietly celebrated because the alternative, strict uniformity, was unbearable in a profession defined by monotony. Certain scrolls inspired profound attachment. A rare astronomy treatise might become someone's favorite companion for weeks, carefully handled, occasionally consulted, and always placed in the exact same position. Occasionally, a librarian would even personalize a scroll, adding marginalia, small notes about the day, a weather observation, or a fleeting thought about a colleague. These were private, subtle markers of human presence in a world of ink and paper. Visitors occasionally complicated the librarian's careful routines. A scholar might request a manuscript in the middle of a meticulous reorganization, or a court official might drop by unannounced, curious about the strange smells and soft whispers. Librarians had to perform a delicate balancing act, answer politely, maintain order, and avoid letting the visitor disrupt the painstaking work they had cultivated over months. More often than not, the visitor left quietly, perhaps impressed by the silence, perhaps puzzled by the obsessive alignment of scrolls, but rarely leaving a lasting mark. Some librarians also kept minor secret collections. A particular scholar's controversial treatise might be tucked away behind more mundane scrolls, accessed only by the librarian who had deemed it significant. These hidden texts could be philosophical, astrological, or literary, and often revealed fascinating glimpses into the intellectual life of the palace. While the caliph rarely noticed, these private collections reflected a curious tension: duty versus personal interest. The librarians obeyed the rules, yet within those rules, they carved out small spaces for their own tastes. Even the act of copying manuscripts carried its own subtleties. Some scribes developed distinctive styles: a faint flourish at the end of a sentence, an extra loop on the letter "cough," or the careful alignment of marginal notes. Errors were corrected with almost imperceptible dabs of ink, and once corrected, the manuscript was practically untouchable. There was pride in precision, though it was quiet pride. No one clapped, no one cheered. The satisfaction was internal, measured in the rhythm of quills and the gentle hum of the library. Night routines were equally delicate. Lamps were trimmed, inkpots capped, and every scroll carefully returned to its designated place. Some librarians lingered longer, reading quietly in soft lamplight, savoring the rhythm of ink on parchment. Others moved slowly, almost meditatively, ensuring that everything was perfect before leaving. Occasionally, a stray rat would be noticed, skittering along the floor, and the librarians would sigh, gently shooing it away. Another minor disruption in the slow, orderly world. Perhaps the most subtle drama came from human relationships. Librarians often developed quiet attachments to colleagues. A shared glance across a shelf, a soft acknowledgement of a particularly clever marginal note, or the gentle teasing about misplaced ink. These connections were understated, sometimes barely noticeable, but they lent warmth to the otherwise repetitive, meticulous world. In a profession devoted to books and scrolls, human connections were rare and therefore quietly cherished. By the late hours, the library fell into near-complete silence. Only the faintest scratching of a final quill or the soft exhale of someone reading punctuated the stillness. Scrolls aligned, inkpots sealed, and the air thick with the faint scent of aged parchment. The librarians retired to their modest quarters, carrying with them the quiet satisfaction of another day completed, another order preserved. And so life continued in the palace, a slow, deliberate rhythm, punctuated by small victories, quiet rivalries, and obsessive attention to detail. Nothing dramatic happened, no wars, no scandals, but the librarians persisted, gently guiding the preservation of knowledge across centuries. It was a world where monotony itself became a kind of elegance. A place where a well-aligned scroll, a perfectly copied manuscript, or a subtle marginal note mattered more than any crown or scepter. The Abbasid Palace librarians, in their quiet, deliberate way, became the unsung custodians of human thought, preserving the rhythm of knowledge with soft hands and calm determination. And as we drift alongside them, moving slowly through corridors lined with scrolls, we notice something comforting: that history does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it scratches softly on parchment, allowing anyone patient enough to listen to float gently into the quiet, measured rhythm of a life devoted to ink, paper, and order. Mornings in the palace library began quietly, though not identically every day. Some librarians rose before sunrise, taking a few minutes to stretch, rinse ink-stained hands, and prepare their quills. Others waited until the soft light filtered through lattice windows, then moved deliberately from one shelf to another. The routine was almost meditative, aligning scrolls, checking for damage, and occasionally tracing faint, faded letters with fingertips. There was a subtle pleasure in repetition, in the slow, mechanical rhythm of daily labor. A standard day often began with what could best be described as inspection rounds. Librarians would move systematically through aisles of scrolls, examining each for wear, discoloration, or the slightest smudge. If a scroll appeared damaged, it might be temporarily removed and placed under a soft cloth, where it would wait for careful restoration. The act of inspecting scrolls was both tedious and deeply satisfying. A perfectly preserved manuscript was, in the eyes of a librarian, a minor triumph. Cataloging was another central ritual. Some librarians preferred alphabetical arrangements, while others organized by subject, date, or origin. Disagreements about classification were common, though never confrontational. It was more a silent competition. Who could devise the most logical, foolproof system? A well-ordered library was a point of pride. A misfiled scroll, on the other hand, could cause quiet, internal frustration for days. Some librarians even kept personal notes, tiny diagrams of shelf arrangements and indexing schemes, as if they feared the inevitable chaos that might arrive if their knowledge were ever lost. Meals were quiet, almost ritualistic affairs. Bread, olives, dates, sometimes lamb or fish, and tea or diluted wine. Conversations were limited, usually revolving around minor corrections in texts or observations about calligraphy. Occasionally, a librarian would remark on a manuscript's smell or texture, and the others would nod, recognizing the subtle expertise in such observations. The room was filled with a soft, sleepy hum of whispered discussion and the faint rustling of parchment. Some librarians had particularly eccentric habits. One, known only as Marwan, insisted on rolling scrolls in a specific clockwise direction, muttering softly as he did so. Another, Zainab, meticulously brushed each shelf daily, believing that even invisible dust disrupted the harmony of knowledge. There were those who scribbled personal observations in margins, tiny reminders of weather, minor annoyances, or fleeting thoughts about colleagues. These marginalia were subtle, often humorous if one paid attention, and gave an almost human touch to centuries-old texts. Afternoons often involved copying texts, though rarely at a rapid pace. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Mistakes were corrected with careful dabs of ink, corrections so subtle they could be easily missed by anyone except a trained eye. The act of copying itself was soothing. The repetitive movement of quill across parchment, the soft scratch of nib against surface, the faint scent of ink lingering in the air. It was a labor both precise and meditative. Librarians occasionally dealt with minor intrusions. Scholars or courtiers might request specific scrolls, sometimes disrupting the meticulous order of shelves. These interruptions were tolerated, though often quietly resented. A librarian might carefully retrieve a manuscript, ensuring that the request caused minimal disturbance, then watch with subtle satisfaction as the scroll was returned exactly as it had been found. It was a delicate dance, requiring patience, precision, and the occasional whispered sigh. Evenings brought slower, reflective work. Some librarians lingered in corners, reading or tracing letters in soft lamplight. Others meticulously inspected manuscripts again, checking for fading ink or slightly bent edges. The act of repeating tasks over and over may sound dull, but it created a rhythm, a gentle, hypnotic cadence that filled the library with a quiet energy. Small victories, a perfectly aligned scroll, a minor error corrected, a shelf restored, were celebrated silently, internally. There was no applause, no recognition, only satisfaction. Some days, librarians engaged in subtle competitions. Who could copy a difficult manuscript with fewer errors? Who could locate a rare text fastest? Who could devise the most efficient classification scheme? These contests were quiet, almost imperceptible, but they lent a faint thrill to otherwise monotonous work. Librarians observed one another with mild curiosity and soft amusement, never openly boasting, yet enjoying the understated victories. The care given to manuscripts extended even to trivial details. Inkpots were meticulously cleaned, brushes rinsed, shelves dusted, margins smoothed. Every movement, every touch, was deliberate. Some librarians even rotated scrolls slightly after copying, believing it preserved the parchment. Others arranged manuscripts by size, color, or density of ink. There was no single right method, only obsessive devotion to order, which, for the librarians, was its own reward. Nightfall was marked by subtle rituals as well. Lamps were trimmed, inkpots sealed, shelves double-checked. Some librarians lingered, reading quietly by lamplight. Others walked slowly along aisles, inspecting the library one last time before leaving. Occasionally, a minor disruption, a stray rodent, a draft from a window, would be corrected with quiet precision. By the time the palace settled into silence, the library was aligned, orderly, and ready for another day. Human interactions, though rare, were understatedly rich. Librarians might exchange a brief glance over a particularly clever note in a margin, or offer a quiet acknowledgement of shared insight. Small gestures, a nod, a soft smile, a whispered correction, conveyed camaraderie in an otherwise solitary world. There was no need for loud laughter or drama. The quiet, shared rhythm of labor was connection enough. And so the days continued, a slow, deliberate repetition of careful routines, gentle rivalries, and subtle pleasures. The Abbasid Palace librarians were neither celebrated nor widely known, yet they maintained the delicate machinery of knowledge. Their work, seemingly dull to outsiders, created a world in which the written word could survive centuries. Their lives were defined by meticulous care, subtle humor, and the gentle satisfaction of perfection pursued quietly, consistently, and without fanfare. The beauty of their existence was in its steadiness. There were no battles, no feasts, no grand declarations. There was only ink, parchment, shelves, and the soft rhythm of dedicated labor. And in that rhythm, a strange, gentle serenity emerged. The world outside the library could rage, but inside, order, patience, and subtle human quirks maintained a quiet, enduring pulse of civilization. Even as night deepened, the librarian's work never truly ceased. A final inspection, a soft touch on a delicate manuscript, a whispered note in the margin, all contributed to the slow, steady preservation of knowledge. It was a life measured not in triumph or tragedy, but in careful attention, subtle victories, and the comforting certainty that, tomorrow, the rhythm would continue. And if we imagine drifting quietly among these scrolls, listening to the faint scratching of quills, the soft rustle of parchment, and the occasional sigh of a tired librarian, it is easy to understand why history sometimes whispers rather than shouts. For those patient enough to listen, the library offers a gentle passage through time, a slow, measured heartbeat of human thought, preserved through centuries by hands that moved with deliberate care, quiet devotion, and just a hint of obsessive love for the written word. The Abbasid Palace library looked peaceful on the surface. Shelves lined up in smooth rows. Manuscripts resting like obedient pets. Inkstones arranged neatly, as if no one ever dared to pick them up. But inside this serene landscape lived a world of subtle, simmering rivalries, because librarians, like any other group forced to work in the same building for too many years, developed grudges so slow-burning they could heat a hammam. No shouting, no sword fights, just pointed politeness, tense silences, and the occasional passive-aggressive placement of a book precisely one shelf too high for a rival to comfortably reach. That, surprisingly, was the height of palace literary warfare. One of the earliest and most legendary of these quiet clashes involved two senior catalogers, Abbasid and Ishaq ibn Musa, both respected, both brilliant, and both absolutely convinced the other was incapable of alphabetizing properly. The conflict bloomed over something astonishingly unimportant, a collection of herbal manuscripts said to be organized slightly off from the standard sequence. Abbasid claimed Ishaq had placed the treatise on saffron after the treatise on sesame. Ishaq insisted he had never touched the shelf. And so began a decade-long feud that remained a complete secret to the Caliph, but was very well known to every apprentice in the building. No one dared intervene. Not because the tension was dangerous, but because it was boring in a very professional way, each man quietly adjusting the arrangement each morning, pretending not to notice the other had rearranged it during the night. It became their private chessboard. No one ever won, but they also didn't stop, and it became part of the library's predictable rhythm, as comforting to hear about as the cadence of prayer calls or the creaking of palmwood shutters. Meanwhile, outside their polite battlefront, the daily rituals continued. First came the mid-morning dusting patrol, a group of 3 librarians who dutifully swept sand from the manuscripts. The Abbasid Palace suffered from constant desert interference. Even with covered windows, curtains, and screens, grains of dust wormed their way into everything. Scripts grew dusty the moment they were opened. The librarians understood this and moved at a pace so slow it made watching wet clay dry look downright cinematic. The youngest apprentice in the group usually carried the softest brush, reserved for extremely delicate manuscripts like early translations of Greek medical texts. He used the brush the way a pigeon uses its wings when trying not to be intimidating, slow, gentle, and slightly confused. Over time he would develop a perfect motion, an arc, a lift, a whisper of dust, and then a long pause as if contemplating the meaning of existence. Senior librarians encouraged this contemplative tempo. Dusting was meant to be meditative. If you finished too fast, it meant you weren't appreciating the manuscript properly. At least, that was the official explanation. The real reason was simply that fast dusting stirred up air currents and made the room sneeze. One librarian, Qasim, had a particularly spectacular sneeze, loud, startling, and unfortunately timed. He tried very hard to suppress it, but the desert air was relentless. Whenever Qasim sneezed, the entire room froze. Loose papers gently fluttered. Apprentices stared in mild horror. Senior catalogers raised their eyebrows with the disappointment of people who had once hoped for silence but no longer believed in fantasies. Qasim always apologized. He apologized so gently it could lull a camel to sleep. And then the ritual resumed. Another treasured ritual was the mid-afternoon quiet round, which was basically a slow walk through the stacks to ensure no manuscript was crooked. This job was reserved for librarians who demonstrated excellent temperament, meaning they accepted their fate without complaint. They moved along the shelves like ghosts in sandals, nudging volumes by a finger width, occasionally whispering things like, "How did you tilt yourself in 1 hour? We just fixed you." One particular manuscript, a biography of a 4th century astrologer, had a habit of sliding sideways for no discernible reason. It annoyed everyone equally. Apprentices believed it was cursed. Senior librarians insisted it was simply bound too loosely by an inattentive scribe. But the real explanation was humidity, which none of them understood well enough to blame directly. So the book became a small superstition within the library, a gentle reminder that nothing stays perfectly aligned, no matter how hard you try. Once the afternoon sun dipped low, the scribes began their end-of-day ink rituals, which were treated with nearly ceremonial seriousness. First, the ink stones were wiped. Then the brushes were washed, dried, and set in their specific slots. The slots mattered. The palace library believed strongly in categorizing not only manuscripts but also tools. Each brush had a personality: the thin Greek script brush, the heavy Quranic script brush, the emergency correction brush reserved for scribes who made small mistakes and tried to hide them before anyone noticed. Washing the brushes required a slow, circular technique. Too fast and you risked bending the bristles. Too slow and you risked looking like you were daydreaming instead of being diligent. A perfect middle ground was expected. Over centuries, scribes passed down little sayings like, "Circular strokes keep the scribe awake," and "Ink listens to patience." These were not deep philosophical truths. They were just things bored copyists said to fill the silence. Another source of mild drama was the wax tablet shortage, which happened several times a year. Wax tablets were the preferred tool for drafting outlines or marking corrections before copying onto parchment. But the palace administrators, who were responsible for ordering materials, never predicted how many would be needed. They always ordered too few. And so the librarians developed elaborate loan systems, trades, and whispered agreements. One man might trade a wax tablet for an extra blotting cloth. Another might offer 3 sheets of scrap parchment for 1 untouched block of wax. All these negotiations were conducted at the softest possible volume. No one wanted the administrators to know the librarians had created their own black market. The stakes were low, but the secrecy made apprentices wide-eyed with excitement. In truth, the administrators probably knew and didn't care. But letting the librarians believe they were running a rebellious underground network brought them quiet joy. Librarians rarely get to feel dramatic. If a wax tablet shortage gave them a tiny sense of rebellion, no one saw reason to ruin it. Meanwhile, the palace scribes continued creating copies of texts the caliph wanted duplicated: treatises on geometry, philosophical commentaries, poetry collections, translations from Sanskrit. Some were interesting. Most were tedious. A good number were written by scholars who thought highly of themselves and used sentences so winding that even the scribes sighed internally while copying. One scribe named Yunus was legendarily slow. Not because he was incompetent, but because he insisted on reading every sentence as he wrote it. He wanted to understand the text fully, believing this made his handwriting more respectful. His colleagues disagreed. They believed his handwriting looked exactly the same as everyone else's. But they admired his commitment to personal philosophy, especially because it slowed him down enough that others could nap while he finished his portion. Occasionally, the caliph requested certain manuscripts be brought to him at night. This task fell to whichever librarian was on the evening rotation. Evening rotations were deeply unpopular. The palace got colder after sunset, and librarians disliked wearing thick outer robes because the sleeves made it harder to carry scrolls. Also, one had to navigate long corridors lit by oil lamps, which flickered dramatically if you walked too fast. So evening deliveries became a test of patience. You moved slowly. You held the manuscript close. You prayed silently that the caliph would not decide he wanted another text immediately after the first. Once the manuscript was delivered, the librarian had to remain nearby, waiting for permission to leave. Sometimes the caliph would ask a question, something harmless, like, "Is there a copy of this by another scribe?" Or, "Do we have a commentary that compares this text to the Indian version?" The librarian always replied with the softest possible tone. Even a hint of confidence was dangerous. The goal was to convey calm competence without sounding like someone who wanted to be there. No one wanted to be there late at night. They wanted to return to the library, sit down at their usual desks, and enjoy the tranquility of a room full of dusty manuscripts and equally dusty colleagues. One slightly infamous evening involved a commentary on Aristotle's logic that the caliph requested at an unusually late hour. The librarian on duty, a man named Abbasid, dutifully went to retrieve it, but found the manuscript missing. Shelf empty. No sign of misplacement. No note. No clue. It was a librarian's nightmare. After several minutes of silent panic, Abbasid discovered that the manuscript was on the desk of a junior scribe who had borrowed it earlier to check a reference, but had forgotten to return it. The scribe was found asleep with his face on the manuscript, leaving a faint ink smudge across the section on syllogisms. Abbasid cleaned it gently, using a trick known to senior librarians: slightly warmed blotting cloth, barely damp. It worked well enough. No one ever mentioned the smudge, but Abbasid did privately begin a lifelong campaign of reminding apprentices to return manuscripts exactly where they found them, every single time, without fail. That small accident became one more ritual, the end-of-shift manuscript patrol, where a librarian walked through all desks checking for books left behind. It was done patiently, never in a scolding tone. The librarians understood apprentices were young, tired, and overwhelmed by the weight of thousands of years of accumulated texts. Gently correcting them became part of the natural rhythm of the building. The palace library existed in this strange balance: structured, disciplined, yet full of tiny, harmless chaos. Nothing dramatic ever happened. The caliph occasionally visited, scholars occasionally argued about footnotes, scribes occasionally ruined a line and started over. But mostly it was quiet, comfortably quiet. a place where the biggest concern was crooked manuscripts and wandering dust. And beneath all that stillness was a sense of pride. The librarians believed deeply, calmly, and consistently that they were guardians of knowledge. Not warriors, not heroes, just quiet people ensuring that words stayed exactly where they belonged. Their work rarely earned praise. Their names seldom entered the chronicles. But they understood something profound in a slow, sleepy sort of way. Civilizations depend on people who are willing to keep the shelves in order, even if they occasionally argue about saffron versus sesame. Training to become an Abbasid Palace librarian was not a glamorous pursuit. No one bragged about it. No one competed for spots the way they did for court poet positions or the slightly more exciting job of royal astronomer. In fact, the librarianship apprenticeship was so undramatic that many applicants were gently nudged into it by relatives who thought, quite reasonably, that the child looked like someone unlikely to enjoy the outdoors or physical exertion. Most apprentices arrived in the palace library around the age of 12 or 13, though some were older, late bloomers who discovered, after attempting several other careers, that copying manuscripts and dusting shelves might be less embarrassing than trying to become a court musician. One boy, Harun the Younger, had originally been apprenticed to a lute master, but his fingers were so slow that the master politely suggested he consider a profession where rhythm is less urgently required. The library seemed the perfect fit. On the apprentice's first day, the senior librarians delivered a very slow tour of the space. They did not rush. They strolled. They paused often. They gestured softly toward shelves, alcoves, reading desks, the index table, the ink-mixing corner, and the corridor leading to the scriptoria. Apprentices were expected to absorb all of this at the pace of warm honey dripping down a bowl. If anyone attempted to walk faster or ask overly enthusiastic questions, a librarian would simply give them a look that conveyed, without words, "Please don't bring that energy in here." The very first ritual an apprentice learned was the Notebook of Observations, a small leather-bound book they carried everywhere. They wrote in it constantly, notes on where certain manuscripts lived, notes on how to mix ink, notes on which shelves tended to tilt slightly due to uneven stones beneath the floor tiles, notes on senior librarians' preferences, because some wanted scrolls returned rolled clockwise, others counterclockwise, and one librarian named Amr insisted that the end of a scroll must always be aligned facing west. When asked why, he simply said, "The parchment prefers it." No one challenged him because librarians, by training, accepted eccentric logic as long as it kept things orderly. Apprentices learned to walk silently. It was almost a form of art. The wooden floors of the palace library had certain boards that squeaked, and novice apprentices stepped on them constantly. Senior librarians, who had memorized every treacherous plank, glided across the room without ever triggering a sound. To help the younger ones learn, older apprentices developed a game, Find the Quiet Path. It involved walking the entire length of the main hall without a single creak, following an invisible trail only insiders knew. No prizes were awarded, just nods of approval. And in a quiet workplace, a nod of approval was the equivalent of thunderous applause. The next skill was breath control. Not for meditation, but to avoid blowing dust onto fresh ink. The librarians had centuries-old warnings carved into the wooden edges of certain desks. Do not exhale deeply upon the words of scholars. Apprentices practiced holding their breath while turning pages, or breathing downward into their robes to avoid disturbing loose parchment. One boy, Sadiq, fainted during early training because he misunderstood and tried to hold his breath for the entire session. The senior librarian gently explained that the goal was soft control, not heroic suffocation. Writing practice came next. Apprentices learned to copy lines of text using diluted ink so the mistakes didn't stain the parchment irreversibly. They trained on broad, plain scraps, often reused from old, abandoned drafts that no one remembered writing. On these sheets, apprentices produced hours of shaky Arabic script, each letter revealing the emotional state of the writer. A nervous apprentice wrote jittery curves. A sleepy apprentice produced droopy lines. A frustrated apprentice pressed too hard, creating dark blotches like sorrowful ink teardrops. One of the most important daily tasks assigned to apprentices was ink mixing, an unexpectedly delicate operation. Ink in the Abbasid Palace wasn't store-bought. It was crafted from soot, water, gum arabic, and sometimes extra ingredients depending on the scribe's preferences. Some liked thicker ink for bold lettering. Others liked lighter ink when drafting translations. Every scribe claimed their formula was superior. Apprentices, caught between conflicting requests, learned to mix small batches at a time, labeling each pot with code words like strong, weak, night copy, or Greek notes, do not touch. Occasionally, a batch went wrong, too watery, too thick, too grainy, too pale. When that happened, the apprentice simply carried the flawed pot to the back courtyard and quietly dumped it into a sand pit designed specifically for ink failures. No one shamed them. The librarians understood ink mixing the way bakers understand bread. Sometimes the dough refuses to rise no matter how skilled you are. Another essential part of training was learning to read handwriting styles, especially the eccentric ones. Some scholars in the Abbasid era wrote beautifully. Elegant curves, balanced lines. Ink so consistent it looked like printed type. Others wrote like they were running late for something emotionally draining. Their letters sprawled across the page like startled insects. Apprentices had to learn to decipher all of it. They studied examples from famous problem writers. The astronomer who used letters so tiny they resembled ants on parade. The physician who wrote everything at a slant, as though his parchment were sliding downhill. The philosopher who refused to lift his pen, resulting in sentences that resembled long, tangled wool fibers. There was a quiet pride in mastering these scripts. Apprentices compared notes, competing gently to see who could read the strangest handwriting. The senior librarians never participated, but they observed with discreet amusement, because they, too, had once spent years deciphering incomprehensible scribbles. One beloved tradition in the palace library was the apprentice's first shelf. After several months of training, an apprentice was assigned a small section of shelving to maintain. The shelves were usually low, away from sunlight and drafts. The apprentice inspected the manuscripts each morning. Were they straight, dusted, in correct order, and gently aligned? It became their tiny kingdom, one they ruled with the calm authority of someone who finally understood how the library breathed. Apprentices gained confidence quickly. They learned which manuscripts needed extra dusting, which ones tended to warp, which ones were borrowed frequently by philosophers, and which ones were never touched by anyone, usually because they contained obscure treatises like On the Proper Construction of Non-Essential Aqueduct Tunnels, a book so boring that even the librarians, connoisseurs of boredom, avoided it. But nothing bonded apprentices with the library quite like the lantern walk, a nighttime ritual experienced only once in training. Toward the end of their first year, apprentices accompanied a senior librarian on an after-hours inspection tour. The library was dark except for a single lantern shared among them. Shadows crawled across the shelves. The air felt cooler, quieter, almost reverent. Apprentices were told to listen, to the faint rustle of parchment cooling, to the soft settling of wooden shelves, to the distant drip from the courtyard fountain. These tiny sounds made the building feel alive in a slow, ancient way. The lantern walk taught them one lesson: the library's silence wasn't emptiness. It was presence, a steady, comforting hum made of stillness and history. Apprentices who understood this stayed. Those who didn't quietly left within weeks. Another subtle part of apprenticeship was learning the personalities of the senior librarians themselves, because each one had a distinct temperament shaped by decades among manuscripts. There was Nafi, who spoke so softly that apprentices occasionally leaned uncomfortably close to hear him, only to realize he wasn't saying anything important. He just liked whispering facts no one needed. There was Zainab, legendary for her ability to remember exactly where any manuscript had been the last 3 times it was misplaced. Apprentices feared and adored her. And then there was Rashid, a librarian who had mastered the art of slow walking to such an extent that even his robes seemed to drift rather than move. Rashid taught one of the most important skills: how to handle manuscripts emotionally. Not physically, everyone learned that. Emotionally. A manuscript, he said, pausing dramatically for the length of an entire breath, is a witness, not a tool. Apprentices nodded, unsure what this meant. Rashid continued. Treat it as a guest. It has traveled centuries to reach your desk. Offer it respect, and it will behave. Show impatience, and it will resist. Did this actually hold true? No one knew. But manuscripts did seem to curl less when Rashid handled them. Perhaps they sensed his deep serenity. Or perhaps decades of practice gave him a calm that made even old parchment relax. Near the end of their apprenticeship, the trainees learned catalogued notation, the crown jewel of librarian skills. They were taught how to write records for new manuscripts, how to categorize texts by subject, origin, scribe, and date. They learned how to cross-reference works by theme, like meteorology, poetry, medical commentary, or philosophical complaints about other philosophers. They copied dozens of index entries until they could recite bibliographic formulas in their sleep. One apprentice, Mukhtar, once actually fell asleep while writing a catalog note, and the pen slid slowly down the page like a sinking ship. His fellow trainees considered this a rite of passage. The senior librarians allowed him to nap for a moment, then gently tapped the desk to wake him. No reprimand. Fatigue was simply part of learning. Eventually, after years of careful guidance, the apprentices took on real responsibilities. They managed scroll repairs using glue so mild that you could accidentally lick it and suffer no consequences. They transcribed difficult manuscripts under the supervision of picky scribes who pointed out every uneven letter with a calm but devastating. They learned the precise folding technique for covering parchment against humidity. And finally, they contributed to the maintenance of the Grand Index, a growing catalog that served as the backbone of the entire palace library. Nothing about the training was spectacular. No dramatic epiphanies. No bursts of inspiration. Just steady hands, patient minds, and slow days spent among manuscripts older than anyone remembered. But that was exactly what made the apprenticeship special. It prepared them for a life lived at the library's pace, a pace measured not by seasons or rains, but by ink drying on parchment, dust settling on shelves, and the gradual fading of covers from sunlight filtering through patterned screens. A life where the greatest thrill might be discovering that a mislabeled manuscript was actually in the wrong category. A life where silence wasn't emptiness, but comfort. A life where serving knowledge meant never rushing, never panicking, and never forgetting that every book had a history of its own. Quiet careers. Quiet pride. Perfect training for guardians of a world that spoke softly. If the librarians formed the quiet skeleton of the Abbasid Palace Library, then the scholars were the nervous system, constantly buzzing, debating, theorizing, and occasionally collapsing from intellectual exhaustion. They filled the reading rooms each morning like migrating birds, settling into their preferred perches with predictable regularity. And librarians who cherished peace learned to coexist with this energetic species using what could only be described as an art form. The art of not interrupting scholars while also ensuring they didn't accidentally destroy anything. Scholars came in many varieties. There were the philosophers who carried themselves with heavy sighs, as though the weight of the universe rested on their quills. There were the legal scholars, whose thick stacks of reference texts made librarians' hearts sink because everyone knew those manuscripts would return with frayed edges. There were mathematicians who muttered numbers under their breath, scribbling diagrams so tiny that even ants would squint at them. And then there were the poets, gentle, melancholy, and prone to staring at the ceiling for hours while composing lines no one requested. Each scholar had habits. Predictable, persistent habits. One philosopher named Hisham always arrived early, carrying a stack of notes that seemed to grow by one page each day. He sat at the same corner desk, placed his elbow in the exact same spot, and began each session with a sigh so long and theatrical that nearby scribes gently rolled their eyes. They claimed Hisham practiced sighing more than reading. He did not deny it. Another scholar, Fatima bint Lulu, specialized in botanical treatises. She smelled faintly of dried lavender because she kept a small sachet of herbs in her writing pouch. It was believed to help her concentration. Whether it truly did was unclear, but librarians appreciated her presence because she handled manuscripts with remarkable care, as though they were fragile little birds that needed gentle nesting. Some scholars, however, were unintentionally destructive. There was Gasson, a legal scholar whose elbows had no respect for spatial boundaries. He would spread scrolls across half the table, nudging other manuscripts dangerously close to inkpots. Librarians trailed behind him like guardian spirits, ready to intervene the moment a page drifted too near the black pool of permanent disaster. Gasson never noticed. He was too focused on whatever legal paradox he was currently untangling, unaware he caused minor panic attacks among the library's custodians almost daily. Then there was Tamim, a grammarian whose handwriting was so prickly and angular that scribes dreaded copying his notes. He wrote with the intensity of a man trying to stab clarity into every sentence. His quill struck the parchment with a staccato rhythm, tap-tap, scrape-scrape, that could be heard across the room. Librarians grew accustomed to it, much like one grows accustomed to a slightly leaky fountain. Annoying at first, then oddly comforting, then eventually unnoticeable. Scholars interacted with librarians frequently, though these interactions followed a pattern. Scholars asked questions. Librarians answered so quietly that scholars had to lean in. Scholars nodded thoughtfully, even if they didn't fully understand the whispered explanation. One common question was, "Do you have a commentary that compares this text to the Syriac version?" To which the librarian would respond, "Third shelf from the left, behind the larger treatise on meteorology that no one reads." Another frequent question was, "Has this manuscript been recopied recently?" And the answer was often, "Yes, but only by Eunice, so be prepared for slow handwriting." Despite their quirks, scholars respected the library's rules, or at least pretended to. The most important rule was no heated debates in the main hall. Scholars loved debating. They debated everything. Whether Aristotle's definition of motion made sense. Whether Euclid had underestimated something. Whether a certain poet was brilliant or simply overconfident with metaphors. But librarians banned loud arguments inside the main space. Debates were allowed only in the side discussion rooms, where the acoustics softened even the most passionate intellectual disagreements into a gentle hum. Not all scholars followed this rule perfectly. One memorable incident involved two mathematicians, Abban and Naufel, who disagreed about the correct interpretation of a geometric proof. The argument began quietly, with polite nods and phrases like, "I see your point, but..." Then voices rose. Hands gestured wildly. A scribe in the corner began silently begging the heavens for tranquility. Finally, a librarian drifted over, moving so slowly that it looked ceremonial, and placed a finger on the table between them. The universal librarian signal for "no." The mathematicians immediately lowered their voices, embarrassed. They continued their debate in whispers so intense that nearby apprentices felt as though they were overhearing forbidden secrets. Another rule scholars often struggled with was no eating near the manuscripts. This seemed obvious to librarians. Food and parchment did not mix. Crumbs were the enemy. Oil stains were unforgivable sins. But some scholars believed that thinking required snacking. So they sneaked in dried dates, almonds, or, on rare, rebellious days, figs. Librarians enforced the rule gently. They didn't confiscate food. Instead, they placed small woven baskets on every desk. If a scholar began eating, the librarian would silently slide a basket toward them, eyes calm, expression neutral. The scholar got the message. Place your forbidden snack in the basket and consume it elsewhere. No confrontation. No shame. Just silent redirection. The scholars who complied earned the librarians' quiet gratitude. Those who didn't usually dropped crumbs at some point and found themselves receiving an extra quiet reminder that dusting manuscripts was extremely difficult when covered in fruit debris. A particularly amusing dynamic existed between scholars and scribes. Scholars produced ideas. Scribes produced legible versions of those ideas. The two groups relied on each other but also harbored subtle resentment. Scholars sometimes wrote drafts that were so chaotic that scribes had to spend hours deciphering them. Scribes, in turn, sometimes copied texts with annotations in the margins like "original unclear" or "perhaps the scholar meant something else." Scholars pretended these annotations didn't irritate them. Librarians observed all this with serene detachment. They walked through the aisles like shepherds guiding a herd of brilliant but easily distracted thinkers. Some scholars were well loved by librarians, especially those who followed a predictable routine. One such scholar was Yusuf ibn Rashid, a historian who always arrived after midday, carrying a small cushion because he disliked the hardness of the palace benches. Librarians found this deeply endearing. Yusuf always greeted the manuscripts with small nods, as though acknowledging their existence was a social requirement. He wrote slowly, paused often, and never left a mess. If all scholars were like Yusuf, librarians mused, their days would be bliss. But scholars were scholars, and scholars required attention. The librarian's role included guiding scholars to appropriate texts. When a scholar requested something obscure, like a commentary on Galen written by a physician whose name was nearly impossible to pronounce, the librarian had to recall exactly where it lived. They led the scholar through the maze of shelves, pointed gently, and sometimes quietly added, "Be careful, this one is brittle." Scholars accepted these warnings with reverence. Knowledge was precious, but librarianship was a kind of priesthood. Scholars recognized that librarians possessed a different kind of wisdom, the wisdom of preservation, order, and patience. One delightful daily ritual was the whisper consultation, where a scholar approached a librarian with a question too long for a simple answer. These consultations were done in hushed tones, both parties leaning over the desk like conspirators. The scholar asked something complicated. "This manuscript cites a commentary written in the reign of Al-Ma'mun, but I cannot find any trace of it. Are we certain it exists?" The librarian responded with equal subtlety, "It exists, but only as a fragment in the medical wing. You may view it, but handle the spine gently, it has suffered." These exchanges had the quiet excitement of secret briefings, even though the subject matter was rarely thrilling. Scholars appreciated the librarian's guidance. Librarians appreciated scholars who respected the rules. Harmony, in its most understated form. But not all interactions were smooth. Occasionally, a scholar became too absorbed and forgot their surroundings. One philosopher wrote so intensely that he failed to notice his sleeve dipping into fresh ink. A mathematician once used a manuscript as a straightedge. A poet fell asleep onto a text of love odes, leaving a faint forehead imprint visible for decades. In such cases, librarians did not scold. They simply appeared beside the scholar like a calm apparition, moved the offending object, gently repositioned the scholar's hands, and glided away. Scholars often did not realize they'd been corrected until moments later. One particularly humorous event involved a very enthusiastic scholar of Greek logic who gestured so wildly while explaining a point to a friend that he knocked over an entire stack of scrolls. They rolled like tiny logs across the floor. The scholar froze, horrified. Librarians, instead of panicking, simply sighed quietly and retrieved the scrolls with methodical grace, as though this were just a routine weather pattern. Perhaps the most touching scholar-librarian relationship involved Jannat, a grammarian who visited the library daily despite her failing eyesight. She requested manuscripts be read aloud to her. Librarians took turns assisting her, reading in slow, steady voices. She corrected their pronunciation occasionally, which the librarians accepted with dignity. Even as her vision dimmed, her mind remained sharp enough to spot errors faster than scribes could correct them. In this gentle collaboration, scholars and librarians formed a small ecosystem of mutual respect. Scholars brought ideas. Librarians ensured those ideas survived. And through it all, the palace library hummed with a kind of sleepy productivity, not rushed, not chaotic, but steady, warm, and deeply human. Nothing dramatic, nothing thrilling. Just scholars thinking and librarians helping them think without damaging anything. Exactly the kind of quiet rhythm that kept knowledge alive for centuries. Let's float over to yet another softly illuminated corner of the Abbasid world, where the librarians were technically respected, but mostly ignored in that politely absent way people reserve for astronomers who won't stop talking about eclipses. By this point in the palace's slow, drifting day, our librarians were already in that late afternoon haze. The kind where everything feels slightly muffled, like someone laid a wool blanket over the entire palace and told everyone to please keep their ambitions at a low simmer. We'll drift in beside one of the quieter types. There were many, but this one was especially committed to the art of near invisibility. He wasn't born into the palace world. He married into it through a cousin of an uncle of someone who might have been vaguely attached to a minor court office. No one quite knew, and no one cared enough to ask. He simply materialized one day, clutching a stack of old notes, as if the palace itself had grown tired of lacking a proper man who barely speaks but always has a scroll on hand, and decided to create one. His name was Ibrahim, although some colleagues called him that one with the sleeves, because his robe sleeves were aggressively long. Long enough that the trailing ends got caught in door frames, candle drips, and once, memorably, inside a jar of ink. The ink incident became a minor palace legend. His sleeves came out looking like a watercolor of a night sky, and instead of washing them, Ibrahim simply shrugged and decided the stains added character. Of course he did. Most days, his duties were simple. He would copy a few passages, check a few catalog entries, drift down a hallway, realize he had forgotten what he was doing, drift back, remember again, and start over. This repeated cycle produced a surprising amount of work, though nobody could explain how. He was like a human loophole, slow, directionless, yet inexplicably productive. When he needed to fetch books from the deeper storerooms, he walked with a sort of soft caution, as if worried he might disturb the dust. The shelves there were crowded, leaning, and just slightly warped by centuries of Baghdad's shifting humidity. Some scrolls stored near the bottom had flattened into soft, paper-like pancakes. Some at the top had curled like sleeping cats. One grand volume, supposedly copied for an Abbasid prince who later forgot its existence, had swollen from water damage into something closer to a decorative footstool than a book. Ibrahim treated each one with equal reverence. His colleagues sometimes teased him gently, because it was impossible not to. His expressions were small, almost microscopic. A whole emotional life occurred at the level of eyebrow shifts. Once, someone asked him if he had any personal hobbies. He blinked slowly and said, "I enjoy watching dust motes fall." They waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. But despite that, Ibrahim had a subtle authority. When a junior librarian needed help deciphering a badly scribbled marginal note from the 9th century, they always asked him first. When someone needed to know whether the caliph's genealogical scroll had been copied in duplicate or triplicate, Ibrahim knew immediately. He was also the only one who remembered which cabinet contained the backlog of near-illegible poetry sent by amateur noblemen, most of which had to be rejected. Politely, of course. He walked with an unhurried rhythm. Even his footsteps sounded like someone exhaling. But inside that calm drift was an obsessive attention to detail. He cared deeply about the work, just quietly. Very quietly. The sort of quiet that made people check whether he was still standing behind them. One of his longest-running tasks involved checking the palace catalog for accidental repetition. The Abbasids copied many texts more than once, some deliberately, some by accident, and some because a scribe forgot he had already done it. Sometimes a text would be listed as new, simply because someone changed its title to something trendier. For example, a medicinal treatise once titled, On the Nature of Waters, mysteriously reappeared a decade later under the name, A Refreshing Discourse on Beneficial Liquids. Same content. Same diagrams. Slightly worse handwriting. Ibrahim caught these things. He would sit at a small desk with a dim lamp and 2 copies of a manuscript, holding each one gently by the edges while squinting with the exhausted concentration of someone comparing nearly identical camels. He made notes. He sighed softly. He fixed things nobody else noticed. True librarian essence. And then there were the bookworms, not metaphorical ones, but the tiny, actual insects that loved to nibble on glue and paper. The palace had them. Every library did. It wasn't a disaster. Just an ongoing truce between humans and creatures who considered the world's accumulated knowledge to be a decent snack. Ibrahim took part in the worm check rotations, though he approached it with a slightly mystical aura. He believed the worms were shy. He believed they admired the writing. He also believed they preferred the taste of bad calligraphy, which, honestly, may have been true. There was one scroll they especially liked. A tedious court record of minor tax disputes from a now-forgotten provincial official. The worms had eaten the margins until the text looked like lace. Ibrahim eventually decided the damage improved the manuscript aesthetically. This was his version of rebellion. Most afternoons, Ibrahim worked near a small courtyard window overlooking one of the palace gardens. It wasn't the grand garden with fountains and marble paths, it was the garden where the gardeners stored tools and left chipped pots when they broke. A half-forgotten patch of mint grew there, along with a lonely fig tree that produced exactly 3 figs per year, always small, always slightly underwhelming. Ibrahim liked that fig tree. He said it had realistic ambitions. Sometimes he watched the palace servants walk by as they carried baskets of laundry or trays of fruit. He never spoke to them directly, but he acknowledged them with the faintest nod, like a monk greeting another monk in meditation. They nodded back, equally soft. This was an entire category of palace communication, quiet people acknowledging each other from a distance. Once a week, Ibrahim assisted with inventory audits. These were slow, tedious sessions involving 3 librarians, 5 inkpots, and the collective hope that nothing had gone missing. Nothing dramatic ever did. The closest thing to a mishap was when a misplaced bookmark led to a 10-minute debate about whether a treatise on mineral remedies still counted as shelved under its original category. These were the sorts of arguments librarians engaged in. Calm, paperwork-based disagreements. The palace occasionally received outside scholars who wanted to browse the archives. Ibrahim dreaded these visits. Not because he disliked scholars, but because they asked questions. Many questions. Questions that derailed his workflow and required him to demonstrate where things were stored. Once, a visiting scholar asked him whether any manuscripts on Greek astronomy had been rebound recently. Ibrahim blinked. Then he walked silently to a cabinet, pulled out a box, handed it over, and floated away. The scholar stared after him, slightly unnerved. Another visitor tried to compliment him on his handwriting. Ibrahim stared at the man with the expression of someone who had not been complimented in 12 years and wasn't entirely sure what to do about it. He said, "Thank you," in a tone that suggested he might need a nap to recover. Evenings were Ibrahim's favorite time. The palace grew drowsier. Lanterns glowed in a washed-out gold. The courtyards cooled. People stopped rushing. The librarians shifted into their final tasks of the day, mostly light reviewing and reorganizing. Ibrahim often stayed later than most. He liked the quiet. He liked the slow tick of time against the walls. Sometimes he sat in a corner with a book that wasn't required reading, usually something obscure, a commentary on medicinal herbs, a grammatical treatise with footnotes longer than the main text, a forgotten poem describing a river that no longer existed. He didn't read quickly. He absorbed the words like someone listening to rain. And yet, despite all his quietness, Ibrahim was surprisingly perceptive about palace politics. He knew which courtier was secretly hoarding paper. He knew which scribe was responsible for that run of particularly sloppy manuscripts. He even knew which eunuch controlled the distribution of inkstones, an oddly powerful position. He simply didn't talk about it. Instead, he collected information like dried flowers and stored it somewhere in the long corridors of his memory. When he walked home from the palace each evening, he carried no books with him. Librarians weren't supposed to. But he carried the day's small thoughts, the misfiled scroll, the worm-chewed manuscript, the quietly triumphant moment when he fixed a catalog entry, and he let them settle somewhere inside, like another layer of soft dust. He wasn't remarkable. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't even especially ambitious. But he was steady, and in a palace full of rivalries, flaring egos, and noblemen who treated every minor inconvenience as a sign of cosmic injustice, steady was its own quiet brilliance. And so the day slid into night with Ibrahim drifting along its edges, sleeves trailing, eyes half-lidded, mind content with its tiny victories. Another calm, uneventful chapter in the life of a man who made serenity into an occupation. Let's drift now toward another set of palace figures who rarely appear in grand histories but quietly kept the Abbasid intellectual world from falling apart, literally. These were the scroll menders, the repairers, the librarians whose entire day revolved around gently coaxing damaged manuscripts back into readable form. They were the quiet whisper behind the library's longevity, the human equivalent of subtle glue holding everything together. Their workspace was tucked into a side room off the main archive. Not one of the glamorous chambers with polished floors and intricate lattice windows. Instead, it had a smaller window that let in a square of indirect light, and the smell of old paper lingered in the air like a permanent resident. Rolls of thin linen, small pots of paste, and stacks of mismatched tools were arranged with a kind of careful chaos. If you asked them why a brush sat beside a lump of beeswax, they would tell you, without blinking, this is simply where it lives. The team consisted of 3 longtime menders and 1 perpetually overwhelmed apprentice who always seemed to be a half step away from losing a crucial scrap of parchment. The elder in charge, if one could even call it charge, leadership in this room felt more like gentle shepherding, was a man named Musa. He had the relaxed posture of someone who had spent a lifetime leaning over tables. His robe was patched in places, but clean. His hands were steady, faintly stained with ink that would probably remain until his final breath. Musa was not a man of many words, and when he did speak, he did so with a slow, even tone that suggested he resented unnecessary syllables. But he had an uncanny instinct for the age of a manuscript just by touching it. He could run a finger along a torn edge and tell you whether a scribe had been right or left-handed. And if you asked him how he knew these things, he would shrug and say, "It tells me," as though the parchment whispered to him during tea breaks. Next to him sat Layla, who came from a family of metalworkers but somehow wandered into manuscript repair the way some people wander into a garden and simply never leave. Unlike Musa, she talked, but only to the manuscripts. She whispered apologies as she cleaned smudges. She offered reassurance while reinforcing tears. She muttered to the stubborn ones, calling them old troublemakers. And she coddled the fragile ones with the reverence some people reserve for expensive pets. If anyone else tried to take a badly damaged page from her desk, she would lift one eyebrow in a way that conveyed a perfectly clear message: no. She believed, quite sincerely, that manuscripts behaved differently depending on who touched them. According to her, some grew tense under inexperienced hands. Others refused to lie flat unless given a moment to compose themselves. Musa rarely contradicted her. He didn't necessarily believe every scroll had a personality, but he wasn't prepared to argue with someone who had coaxed whole treatises back from the brink of disintegration. The third veteran mender was Farid, a wiry man with an anxious air, the sort of person who checks his own pockets twice before leaving a room. His specialty was ink stabilization. This meant he spent much of the day identifying which manuscripts were written with iron gall ink that had grown acidic over time and begun to eat through the paper. Farid had a talent for spotting trouble. He could look at a manuscript for 3 seconds and announce, "Yes, this one will try to crumble by next year if we ignore it." He never quite relaxed. Even when he sat, he perched. Even when he breathed, he did it cautiously. Perhaps he had simply spent too many years witnessing manuscripts split, flake, stain, warp, or fade into near oblivion. Whatever the reason, he approached every scroll with the wary attention of someone defusing a tiny, papery bomb. And then there was the apprentice, a boy named Tariq, newly arrived, fresh-faced, hopeful. He copied repair techniques with the sincerity of an overeager puppy. And like a puppy, he had a knack for causing minor chaos without meaning to. He once dropped an entire set of trimming knives because a palace cat wandered in and startled him. On another memorable afternoon, he managed to glue 2 of his fingers together. He tried to hide it. He failed. But the menders liked him. He tried hard, which was the only requirement. And he paid attention, another rare trait. Their days unfolded slowly. Repair work demanded patience. It also demanded stillness. You can't rush reattaching a flaking corner. You can't hurry through cleaning mold from a manuscript without risking catastrophic loss. The room filled with the hush of soft scraping, the faint clink of pottery, the rustle of old fibers stretching reluctantly back into place. Sometimes Musa read short passages aloud, not for entertainment, but for testing. If a repair held, the page stayed flat. If it didn't, air puffed through a weakened seam. He read in a droning, monotone voice. Tariq once said it sounded like a recitation meant to lull the manuscript into cooperation. Musa didn't deny. The manuscripts brought to them varied wildly. One day, they might repair a scroll documenting palace expenditures, mostly grain, fabrics, and an alarming amount of candle-making supplies. Another day, they would work on a commentary on Aristotle that some past scholar had annotated in the margins with increasingly irritated notes. And occasionally, they received manuscripts whose original owners were so long forgotten that no one in the palace remembered why they were kept. But the menders repaired them anyway. Reflexively. Automatically. That was their role. Their room rarely attracted visitors. Why would it? No one wanted to stand around watching people reattach old scraps of parchment. But the librarians passed through regularly with deliveries. Some brought manuscripts with apologies. Some brought them with relief. Others brought them with the casual indifference of officials checking chores off a list. The menders never complained. They simply took each damaged piece, examined it under the slow sweep of lamplight, and began the long, deliberate process of coaxing it back to life. One of their longest projects involved a giant genealogical chart that had been folded and unfolded so many times that its creases looked like a road map carved into the vellum. The chart traced lineages that no one needed anymore, but nobody dared discard it. It had the faint scent of stale incense and the unfortunate stiffness of something heavily mishandled by court officials pretending to know how to carefully review documents. It took the team 10 days to relax the folds. Slowly, patiently, Layla steamed the back of the chart so gently that she might as well have been coaxing a shy animal out of hiding. Musa pressed sections under weighted boards. Farid stabilized the ink so it stopped flaking. Tariq held things and tried not to sneeze. When they finally unfolded the chart fully, it turned out to contain 3 errors, 2 missing cousins and a prince whose name had been spelled incorrectly since the manuscript's creation. The librarians debated whether to correct it. Musa, without looking up, murmured, "Leave it. That prince never cared anyway." That settled the matter. Afternoons in the repair room had a predictable cadence. Sunlight slanted in through the window in a pale square. Dust drifted lazily. The workers grew quieter, not because they were tired but because the room itself encouraged slowness. Even Tariq would sometimes pause mid-task, caught in the hypnotic trance of watching Musa trim a frayed edge with a blade so small it looked like a splinter of polished moonlight. Tea breaks were essential. Not for conversation. Usually only Layla spoke, narrating the stubbornness of whatever manuscript she was repairing, but because hands needed rest. Steady hands tired slowly but deeply. Tea soothed them. Warm cups soothed minds. And the brief pause let the manuscripts breathe too, according to Layla's private, unshakable beliefs. At twilight, their work slowed further. Shadows lengthened on the tables. Lamps flickered gently in the currents of warm air. The smell of paste and beeswax thickened. The palace outside murmured with distant footsteps, quiet conversations, maybe the soft clink of a tray being carried to a noble's quarter. Sometimes, Musa hummed. Just a few tuneless notes. Not quite a melody. More a reminder that humans existed in the room. Farid occasionally murmured calculations about drying times. Tariq daydreamed about not gluing his palms together again. And Layla kept coaxing her manuscripts through whatever emotional phase she believed they were having. Their work was slow, repetitive, and borderline meditative. But it mattered. Without them, the palace's intellectual treasures would have faded, crumbled, or been quietly eaten by insects with questionable taste. They were the keepers of fragile memory, even if no one ever gave them a title that grand. They didn't need it. Their pride lived in the soft satisfaction of a repaired page lying flat. A formerly tattered scroll now legible. A tear neatly reinforced at the edges. It was quiet work, invisible work, but enduring work. And so their days passed, unremarked by chroniclers, unnoticed by nobles, but woven deeply into the steady hum of Abbasid palace life. The scroll menders, patiently coaxing the past into surviving one more generation. Let's float over now to a corner of the palace where geography, ambition, and deeply unhurried artistic choices met in a gentle collision. This was the cartographer's room. Technically, They were part of the scholarly wing, not the formal library staff, but the librarians relied on them constantly. They were the people who drew the maps, redrew the maps, debated the shapes of rivers, and argued about coastlines as though the fate of empire depended on whether a peninsula curved a little more to the east. The Abbasid cartographers were not explorers. Absolutely not. They had no intention of leaving the palace. Most of them disliked going outside the courtyard, let alone into distant deserts or mountain passes. Their maps were compilations, patchworks of reports, merchant gossip, older Greek sources, and whatever a traveling scholar on his way to India felt like bragging about. If a caravan leader exaggerated the size of a distant oasis, the cartographers shrugged and added a slightly bigger circle. If someone described a mountain range as impressive, they shaded it in a little more dramatically. The results were beautifully inaccurate, but they were very proud of their work. The head of the cartography section was an elderly man named Yusuf. His eyebrows were so long and so expressive that they practically counted as extra limbs. They twitched like curious animals whenever he examined a new piece of geographic information. Yusuf had a voice that drifted like wind-blown sand, soft, raspy, and slow. Talking to him felt a bit like listening to someone read a bedtime story, except the story was about river deltas. He had spent his entire career drawing and redrawing the same major trade routes, improving them by tiny increments that most people wouldn't notice. Better accuracy, he would say, tapping a point on the parchment that looked identical to yesterday's version. Essential for clarity. No one argued with him, mostly because they had given up trying to spot the differences. Next to him sat a cartographer named Amira, whose steady hands were the pride of the department. She inked coastlines with delicate curves that gave the illusion of gentle waves. She shaded mountain ranges so subtly that they looked like they were sighing. And she never rushed. If she needed a whole afternoon just to draw one meandering section of a river, she took it. The river didn't mind. She didn't mind. Time didn't mind either, apparently, because the hours slipped by with the soft inevitability of sand falling in an hourglass. Amira loved working in silence. She claimed that if someone talked too loudly, her coastlines turned jittery. Once, during a brief palace renovation, the stonemasons hammered too close to her workroom. She paused after each thump, waited for the vibration to fade, and then resumed her line. When a colleague asked if it affected the map, she nodded and murmured, "It made the Arabian coastline anxious." No one laughed. They weren't sure she was joking. Another member of the team was Dawood, a younger cartographer who specialized in labeling. Calligraphy, to be specific. He could write the name of a city in a script so elegant that visiting scholars sometimes asked for copies just to show off at home. But Dawood had a problem. He worked too slowly even by librarian standards. He could stare at a blank space on the map for several minutes before committing to a single curve of a letter. Once, he spent half a day debating whether the tail of a letter should be a fraction longer. He settled on yes, but the decision exhausted him. And of course, every cartography office needs someone who isn't fully sure how they ended up there. That role fell to a former scribe named Jaffer. He wasn't technically a mapmaker. He didn't draw rivers or label towns. He collected source material, reports from merchants, scribbled notes from travelers, scraps of old maps that had been torn or folded beyond recognition. Jaffer wandered the palace halls like a sleepy crane, quietly gathering any document that even vaguely resembled geographic information. Then he brought it back, dropped it gently onto Yusuf's table, and left without explanation. Sometimes the information was useful. Sometimes it was hilariously contradictory. Once, he returned with 2 reports from different travelers describing the same city. One claimed it had tall white walls shining like polished bone, while the other insisted its walls were muddy, cracked, and entirely unremarkable. Yusuf considered both descriptions, tapped his long eyebrow thoughtfully, and drew the walls as a medium gray. Compromise was the backbone of their cartography. The map room itself was always a little cluttered. Not messy, just comfortably filled. Rolls of parchment leaned against the walls. Boxes of pigments sat open, their colors muted by fine dust. Bronze compasses, straightedges, brushes, and inkstones were arranged in little clusters around the desks. Everything had a place, even if that place occasionally migrated. Air drifted through the single tall window, carrying the scent of dry parchment and whatever spices the kitchen had been using that day. The light shifted slowly across their desks, marking the passage of time in quiet gold tones. No one rushed. Rushing led to crooked borders. Crooked borders led to diplomatic misunderstandings. Or so Yusuf insisted. Their daily routine was simple. In the morning, the cartographers reviewed whatever new information Jaffer had procured overnight. Sometimes it was a small scroll describing a distant governor's new irrigation project. Sometimes it was a shaky little sketch made by a merchant who never held a stylus properly. Sometimes, disappointingly, it was nothing at all. On such days, they continued refining existing maps. Refinement was a delicate art. Amira might soften a mountain range. Dawood might adjust a city label to give it a touch more dignity. Yusuf might redraw a coastal inlet with the same intensity a poet uses to choose the final line of a verse. They worked in a gentle rhythm. They breathed slowly. They inked slowly. They existed slowly. Conversations, when they happened, followed the same pace. "Is this caravan road correct?" Amira would murmur. Yusuf would lean in, squint, and after 15 seconds reply, "More or less." Which part is more? The pause. The top. And the less. Another pause. Most of the rest. She nodded. That was enough detail for her. When they weren't drawing or labeling, they were studying older maps. Some came from Greek sources, wonderfully wrong but charming in their confidence. Others came from Persian predecessors. Some came from earlier Arab geographers who enthusiastically labeled things like region of uncertain tribes or mountain so tall it touches the stars. The cartographers treated all these claims respectfully. Wild exaggerations didn't bother them. They simply shrank the mountain a bit, reduced the tribe region to a vague shape, and carried on. Their favorite project, the one that took up a whole section of the room, was the grand map of the Abbasid realm. It sprawled across a long table, weighted at the corners with polished stones. This map was never finished. It was always being adjusted, new towns added, old routes redrawn, rivers given a slightly more graceful curve. Scholars praised it. Diplomats consulted it. Even the Caliph occasionally glanced at it during meetings, although he usually pretended he understood more geography than he actually did. But despite the map's political importance, the cartographers continued working at the pace of drifting clouds. They didn't believe in sharp lines or quick updates. A map was a living thing. It evolved slowly, very slowly. Faster than Dawood's calligraphy, perhaps, but not by much. Late afternoons were the best time in the cartography room. The warm light softened. The pigments glowed in their clay jars. Shadows stretched comfortably across the floor. The whole room felt like a landscape painting in progress. Yusuf sometimes dozed off in his chair, only lightly, only with one eye. The others continued working as though this were an entirely normal feature of the workflow. And in truth, evenings brought a gentle winding down. Brushes were rinsed. Inkstones were closed. Parchments were carefully rolled. The grand map was covered with a protective cloth. Yusuf cracked his knuckles loudly enough to remind everyone he was old. Amira stretched her fingers. Dawood sighed like someone who had carried the emotional weight of too many labels. And Jaffer wandered in late, always late, to drop off one last bit of information. Once, that late-night delivery was a tiny scrap describing a rumored island in the far south. No one could confirm it actually existed. Merchant accounts contradicted one another. Scholars argued about it. But Yusuf looked at the scrap, looked at the grand map, shrugged, and placed a tiny dot in the corner. "Possible island," he murmured. That was as official as it ever became. By nightfall, the cartography room grew silent. The tools rested. The maps slept. And the cartographers drifted out into the dim palace hallways, walking at the same gentle pace they used for everything else. They left behind no dramatic achievements, no grand adventures, no stunning discoveries. Just slow, careful maps that guided an empire and occasionally baffled travelers who expected coastlines to be slightly more accurate. But that was the charm. Their maps were thoughtful. dreamy, almost meditative, and they reflected the people who made them, calm, deliberate souls shaping the world one quiet line at a time. If you've been with me through the earlier chapters, and honestly, I admire your endurance if you have, you'll know that ancient bureaucracies had a special talent for turning even the simplest task into a multi-step, soul-draining ritual involving wax tablets, duplicate copies, and at least one person whose entire job was simply to nod solemnly. Chapter 11 continues our slow drift through that landscape, this time focusing on one of my absolute favorite recurring characters in the world of history, the perpetually unimpressed scribe. You've seen them. You know them. Somewhere on the walls of ancient Egypt, tucked in the margins of Mesopotamian cuneiform, or staring blankly from a medieval monastic manuscript, there's always a figure holding a stylus with the same tired, "I cannot believe I'm documenting this nonsense again" expression. And to be fair, if you spent your entire life recording grain tallies, noble gossip, and the occasional prophetic dream about oddly shaped cows, you, too, might cultivate an expression of cosmic exhaustion. But let's slow down, very slowly, and drift into the origins of these scribes, because I promise it's more soothing than it sounds. The dawn of the documented eye roll. Our journey begins in ancient Sumer, around 3200 BCE, where writing didn't start with poetry or dramatic epics but with receipts. Of course it did. Humanity's first impulse upon learning to make symbols was apparently, let's keep track of barley. Archaeologists have found tablets inscribed with nothing but monotonous, repetitive entries such as 7 jars delivered, 7 jars owed, 7 jars missing, check again. It is during this period that scholars believe the first, "I am so done with this" scribe face emerged. You can practically imagine one sitting cross-legged on a reed mat, slowly pressing wedge-shaped impressions into wet clay while thinking, "If one more person brings me a jar count, I'm inventing a new writing system that only I can read." And honestly, that might explain cuneiform, Egyptian scribes, and the art of looking bored in profile. Fast forward a millennium or two to ancient Egypt, where scribes became full-blown rock stars of administration, though their faces remained utterly unimpressed. Egyptian art is famously consistent, bodies in perfect profile, eyes forward, shoulders wide. But even within that strict artistic code, scribes somehow radiate an aura of, "I have absolutely seen it all." Their training was rigorous. Students copied the same passages over and over. Be a scribe, and your body will be sleek. The scribe's life is superior to all professions. Do not be like the carpenter, who is tired. It's strangely motivational, if you overlook the fact that the student scribes were probably writing this while their teachers barked at them for crooked hieroglyphs. But in a society where literacy was rare, scribes were indispensable. They tracked taxes, tallied grain, recorded royal decrees, and preserved the rather dramatic life stories of pharaohs who, let's be honest, were often doing the ancient equivalent of posting selfies with long captions. Still, for all their importance, most depictions show them with utterly unreadable expressions, maybe the first historical example of a perfected neutral face. Medieval monks and the slow copying of questionable texts. Now we drift into Europe's Middle Ages, where a very different class of scribes, monastic scribes, took on the monumental task of preserving ancient texts by copying them word for word. Their workplaces? Scriptoriums, which were basically quiet rooms filled with chilly drafts, flickering candles, and the constant temptation to write sarcasm in the margins. And sometimes they did. Some of the most relatable scribal notes in history come from these monks. This parchment is too thin. The ink is bad today. The pen is atrocious. Oh, my hand. Oh, my hand. Possibly the most universal work complaint of all time. You can almost hear the sigh behind it, the long, weary exhale of someone halfway through copying a 500-page genealogy that starts with 3 brothers who share 2 names. If there was ever a group deserving of a nap, a long, centuries-long nap, it was these monks, the unimpressed scribe as the silent witness of civilization. Across civilizations, scribes developed a unique ability. They became the quiet anchors of history. Rulers rose and fell. Empires expanded and collapsed. Temples burned, rebuilt, burned again, and were rebuilt with slightly worse craftsmanship the second time. Through it all, scribes just kept writing. Sometimes they were recording taxes. Sometimes they were documenting royal extravagance. Sometimes they were noting that Brother Aidan spilled ink on the manuscript again. But always they were observing. And in their silence, in their tiny marginal complaints or the flat expressions carved into stone, we glimpse an unexpected consistency. No matter the era, the culture, or the medium, people doing tedious paperwork look exactly the same. Why they fascinate us? The unimpressed scribe has become a quiet comedic figure in modern historical imagination, not because they were trying to be funny, but because their expressions feel timeless. They remind us that behind the grand tapestries of history were ordinary people with sore wrists, aching backs, and a deep desire for someone, anyone, to invent the printing press already. And eventually, someone did. But that's for another chapter, preferably one where we drift gently into the slow, inevitable march toward mechanical reproduction and the equally unimpressed faces of early printers. For now, let us simply appreciate the scribes, the weary custodians of human memory, the original office workers, and the eternal champions of the understated eye roll. If you've ever wandered through a museum and seen a row of ancient jars, usually beige, sometimes cracked, always vaguely lumpy in that handmade but not in an Etsy way sort of vibe, you might not realize that you're looking at the backbone of early civilization. Yes, jars. Storage vessels. The unsung heroes of human development. Nothing says we're shifting from a nomadic lifestyle to a complex agricultural society quite like someone deciding, you know what? We need a dedicated container for our stuff. It's funny, really. Empires rise and fall, but the storage jar is forever. So in this chapter, we'll drift gently, slowly, sleepily through the labyrinth of ancient pottery, a world far more dramatic than anyone with a quiet, calming YouTube history channel has any right to discuss. The humble origin story of clay that tried its best. Our story begins long before writing, long before temples, long before that one guy in every village who claims he invented beer. Early humans noticed that mud could be shaped, dried, and if you were lucky and didn't live in a place that rained every 12 minutes, used to hold things. Over time, they learned to fire it, a tremendous upgrade that transformed fragile mud bowls into what were essentially ancient Tupperware. The earliest pots were crude, uneven, and often shaped like someone had tried to remember what a bowl looked like from a dream. But they did the job, holding grains, seeds, water, and occasionally small animals who probably should not have been inside jars in the first place. Enter the Neolithic pottery revolution. As societies settled into farming, pottery started getting fancy. Patterns appeared. Handles emerged. Someone invented the spout, which probably caused an entire village to go, "Why didn't we think of that earlier?" It was a quiet technological revolution, the sort that didn't involve battles or dramatic betrayals but did involve someone saying, "Let's put two handles on it," and being hailed as a visionary. But the real prestige? That came with the storage jar, tall, sturdy, thick-walled, and capable of holding an impressive amount of barley. In civilizations where grain was literally the basis of wealth, your jars were basically your bank account. A good storage jar said, "I am prosperous." A cracked storage jar said, "Please do not lean on that wall." Egyptian jars. Where function meets, we should decorate everything. By the time we reach ancient Egypt, jars were everywhere. Painted, carved, inscribed, sometimes with lists of contents, sometimes with prayers, and sometimes with artistic flair that, frankly, the jar probably did not need to store onions. The most dramatic jar genre, of course, was the canopic jar, which held organs removed during mummification. These came with lids shaped like the heads of divine protectors, falcons, jackals, humans, baboons, forming what might be the most unsettling spice rack in world history. Yet, despite the existentially alarming purpose, the craftsmanship is stunning. You can almost imagine an artisan smoothing the clay and thinking, well, this is definitely the oddest item I'll make this week. Greek amphorae, the celebrity jars of antiquity. If jars had a red carpet event, amphorae would be the main attraction. Tall, elegant, symmetrical, the kind of pottery that says, Someone here had a potter's wheel and took it very seriously. Amphorae held everything from olive oil to wine to grain, and they were so important that people literally signed their names on them. Some amphorae even traveled internationally, carrying wine across the Mediterranean like ancient shipping containers, except with more decorative flair and fewer shipping delays. What's especially charming is that amphorae were often painted with scenes of daily life, mythology, or competitive sports. Imagine opening your kitchen cabinet and seeing your storage containers featuring detailed scenes of the Olympics. Function and drama, side by side. Roman storage jars, bigger, bulkier, better, mostly. Then Rome arrived, and as with all things Rome touched, jars became larger, heavier, and produced in mind-boggling quantities. A Roman warehouse wasn't just a warehouse, it was a cathedral of jars, stacked row after row, like an amphora army awaiting deployment. The Romans had wine jars, grain jars, oil jars, fish sauce jars, for the infamous garum, and storage containers so large that if you tipped one over, it might count as a minor architectural disaster. And because Rome kept incredible records, we even have the names of some jar manufacturers. Yes, ancient potters had brand recognition. Your household might have preferred Marcus of Ostia jars over Lucius the Kiln Guy, because Marcus fired his clay longer, or because Lucius's jars had a troubling tendency to explode. Pottery as the archaeologist's favorite gossip source. One of the most soothingly delightful aspects of pottery is how much archaeologists adore it. If this were a sitcom, pottery would be the side character who doesn't speak but somehow carries every scene. Because storage jars do not lie. They show trade routes. They reveal what people stored and valued. Their shapes change slowly over time, like a pottery-based calendar. And if someone dropped one, well, congratulations. Archaeologists now have a complete excavation layer to analyze. The amount of information a broken jar can reveal is so impressive that some archaeologists specialize in pottery alone. Entire academic careers have been built on analyzing one region's amphora fragments. And yes, they are genuinely thrilled about those fragments. The quiet drama of preservation. What's perhaps most soothing about these jars is their endurance. While scrolls crumble, fabrics rot, and metal rusts, pottery stays. It stays through floods, fires, invasions, earthquakes, and the questionable construction decisions of ancient city planners. Jars persist. Jars remain patient. Jars keep their secrets, or at least keep them until an archaeologist with a very soft brush shows up. Why jars matter more than you think. It may feel slow studying pottery. It may feel mundane. But storage jars are one of the clearest windows into the quiet rhythms of ancient life. They show us what people ate, what they traded, how they stored wealth, and what they bothered to decorate when they had a spare afternoon. And perhaps most charming of all, jars remind us that civilization is built not just on kings and battles, but on containers, the simple vessels that made it possible to save food, transport goods, and survive winters. So the next time you see an ancient jar in a glass case, remember, it was once a vital tool, a household fixture, and maybe, just maybe, the subject of a proud potter's bragging rights. If you've ever imagined medieval monks as serene figures sitting quietly with quills and candles, you are mostly correct. But if you imagine their libraries as equally serene, well-organized spaces, that's a charming fantasy the Middle Ages would like to politely decline. Monastic filing systems were complex, inconsistent, occasionally brilliant, occasionally baffling, and always created by someone who probably hadn't slept very well since the winter of 1123. Tonight, or well, in this chapter, we're going to float through that world. The calm, repetitive routines of monks who wanted nothing more than to keep their manuscripts safe, dry, and in some kind of order that would make sense to someone, someday, hopefully. We're drifting into the medieval abbey. No drama, no invasions, just shelving systems and cataloging rules. It is deeply uneventful. Exactly what you want as you fall asleep. When books were pricier than real estate. To begin, it's helpful to remember that books in the early Middle Ages were outrageously expensive. A single manuscript could represent a year of copying, imported parchment, rare pigments, multiple scribes arguing about spelling, and at least one monk who had to go lie down because he accidentally smudged a decorative capital letter. Books were investments. Books were treasures. And more importantly, books were a massive headache to store. By the 9th century, monasteries were building dedicated library rooms, sometimes just a single chamber attached to the cloister, sometimes a full multi-level structure. But no matter the scale, the goal was always the same: keep the books safe, categorized, and easy to find. Easy, of course, being relative. The put it wherever there's space method. In early medieval libraries, the most common organizational system was essentially, let's just put the book on the next available shelf. It wasn't elegant, but it worked well enough. Books were rare, shelves were limited, and if Brother Anselm needed the Psalter, well, he probably knew exactly where it was because he used it every day. This method only became a problem when visitors arrived. Imagine a monk from another abbey asking politely, "Do you happen to have the writings of Augustine on grace?" And the local librarian, squinting thoughtfully, saying, "We did, unless Brother Cuthbert borrowed it and forgot to bring it back. Let me check the scriptorium, and the refectory, and maybe the infirmary for some reason." Everything was tidy, just not systematic. The rise of the armarium, monastic bookshelves with a fancy name. To address the growing collection sizes, monasteries introduced the armarium, essentially a large built-in cabinet or room used for storing scrolls and codices. Some had shutters, some had chains, some were just open cupboards with a lot of confidence. Inside the armarium, monks stored books by size, to save space. Very practical, very logical, and absolutely catastrophic for anyone trying to find a specific text. But at the time, the priority wasn't intellectual browsing. It was preservation. Tight shelves were safer. Tidy vertical stacks prevented curling. And if someone needed to find a certain book, well, they could always wake the librarian from his peaceful afternoon nap and ask. Enter the medieval catalogue, a list that never agreed with the shelves. As libraries grew, monks began keeping book lists, early catalogues, written in careful script, often in the monastery's own house style. These lists were wonderfully thorough and completely disconnected from reality. Some catalogues listed books in the order the scribe remembered them. Some organized them by genre, even if they weren't shelved that way. Some grouped them by the donor who originally gifted them, because medieval record-keeping loved a good donor name. If you wanted to find a book, you first found its name in the catalog, then asked someone where it actually lived, and then hoped they remembered. It was a storage system built on faith. Literally. Shelving by theology. A system with a very predictable hierarchy. By the 12th and 13th centuries, some monasteries attempted systems based on content. Predictably, this meant God at the top, theology on the next shelves, philosophy somewhere below, history lounging modestly, and sciences hiding on the lowest levels like apologetic but enthusiastic houseguests. This was, surprisingly, the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a modern library system. It wasn't perfect, but at least a monk could make an educated guess. I want a commentary on Job, so I should look somewhere between the Augustine shelf and the Gregory shelf, unless someone moved it, or touched it, or borrowed it during Lent. Books in chains, not symbolic, just practical. We tend to think of chained books as dramatic, something from a dark fantasy novel. But for medieval monastic librarians, it was simply a practical anti-theft device. Books were priceless, took months or years to reproduce, and were occasionally too tempting for wandering scholars. So libraries attached chains to expensive volumes and fixed them to desks or shelves. This prevented the books from wandering off with absent-minded academics, which, frankly, was a very real problem. The chains were not a punishment. They were just medieval security, like a polite sign saying, "Please read this here. We love you but do not trust you." The lectern library, one book, one desk. Some monasteries created lectern libraries, where each book was placed on a slanted reading desk with its chain. Books were arranged in rows of desks rather than shelves. The advantages: excellent lighting for reading, good airflow for parchment, zero risk of losing a book behind another book. The disadvantages: lots of space. The awkwardness of reading a book in public while several monks passed by with silent judgment. And, most importantly, no way to discreetly borrow a book unless you were strong enough to carry the whole desk home. It's hard to imagine anything less convenient. But to a monk in the 13th century, it was cutting-edge library science. The great medieval love of labels. Monks labeled everything. Book covers, shelves, cupboards. Sometimes the labels even matched what was inside. Typical label might say, Sermons of the Holy Fathers, miscellaneous works of unknown origin, books of various sizes, or the deeply mysterious, items not yet assigned. The problem was that parchment scrolls and bindings aged at different rates. A label from 1150 might still be clear, but the book it described could be long gone. A different text might have been placed there instead, and that new text could be mislabeled in 5 other places. It was like watching someone organize their closet by vibes. The scribe's desk, the true heart of chaos. While libraries tried their best to look orderly, the scriptorium was where the real chaos lived. The copying desks were usually covered with loose parchment scraps, blank quills, half-finished doodles, and manuscripts temporarily stored just for now. A scribe might place a book on a corner of the desk during winter and forget about it until spring. Then it might get shelved somewhere new, or moved to the library, or placed in a basket reserved for books that needed rebinding. And none of this was recorded. This is how libraries slowly developed the worst label of all, lost in the monastery. Borrowing rules that nobody followed. Many monasteries wrote strict rules for borrowing books. These rules were beautifully phrased, spiritually justified, and almost entirely ignored. Borrowing was essential. Monks taught lessons, copied texts, prepared sermons, and traveled between houses sharing manuscripts. But each of these moments introduced the risk that a book would wander. This led to passive-aggressive notes in catalogues, like, "This book is missing. It was here last year. We believe Brother Stephen borrowed it. It has not returned." Medieval librarians were writing the world's earliest overdue notices. The monastic anxiety about dampness. If there was one thing that medieval librarians feared almost as much as losing a book, it was moisture. Damp air ruined parchment. It warped bindings. It encouraged mold, the mortal enemy of the written word. So libraries were often placed on upper floors, near windows, in rooms with vents, and far from kitchens, baths, and anything humid. Some libraries even had rules forbidding monks from entering with wet cloaks. Imagine a gentle, sleepy librarian whispering, "Please dry off before you come in." The manuscripts have suffered enough. Cataloging by memory, the surprisingly reliable method. Despite the haphazard systems, many monastic librarians had astonishing recall. They knew which texts they had copied, which volumes other monks used often, where the most important treatises sat, and which books smelled faintly of damp wool for reasons never fully explained. This memory-based cataloging worked remarkably well so long as the librarian lived a long time. But when a librarian passed away, the entire library effectively reset. The next librarian inherited a room full of books arranged in a system only the previous librarian understood. It was not ideal, the ancient precursor to shelf marks. Eventually, late medieval libraries invented something that feels very modern: shelf marks, combinations of letters or numbers that indicated a book's location. Something like A.3, B.12, upper east shelf, third position.